where he said that in the end of the day, reason doesn't matter. He still hasn't addressed that point. Now, to turn to some of the things that Dr. Craig does address, let's go through some of them. He started off by saying that my burden of proof argument, as he fairly enough called it, rested on a straightforward logical fallacy. And the idea was that just because an argument isn't sound, just because its premises aren't true, or the conclusion doesn't follow from the premises, that doesn't show that the conclusion is false. Of course, that fact of logic is not in dispute. But that's true about any statement. That's true about the statement, there is a tooth fairy. That's true about the statement, there are leprechauns. If I can show that we have no more reason to believe in God than we have to believe in leprechauns, or if Dr. Craig can't show that to be false, then that's all I care about showing. I don't believe in leprechauns. I don't believe in the tooth fairy. Neither do any of you. What I want to know is whether there's any better reason for believing in God. The second point, and this comes to the argument from evil, as I put it, Dr. Craig raised the objection, and this strikes me as slightly strange, but Dr. Craig did raise the objection that we can never actually know whether the harm that happened was good or evil. We can never actually know whether what happened in the First World War, for example, was at the end of the day the best thing. Now just think for a minute what this means. As I said, this is not an academic parlor game. It's very easy, especially for academics, who, unless they try, have very little exposure to the real world. It's very easy to lose sight of the distinction between opening your mouth and saying something as part of a game and actually meaning it. What Dr. Craig is telling us is that the Holocaust, for example, is something of which we can't say whether it was for the best. For all we know, we should suspend judgment as to whether the Nazi Holocaust was at the end of the day for the best. Now, I hope you want to think about that before you start saying something like that. Okay, the next point was that supposedly God couldn't adjust these things because they're so intricately bound to their effects. The idea was that God, if he were to change certain events which involved harm, that would redound to certain other events, and at the end of the day, people wouldn't have the experiences or the values that he thinks they should have. The example that he gives is the idea that if you do believe that there are some goods outside of this life, as well as goods in this life, then for all we know, the harm that I call gratuitous actually redounds at the end of the day to our having a better next life. Now, that argument, of course, is completely question-begging and circular in this context. The whole issue is whether God exists. The whole issue is whether there's an afterlife. We can't start by assuming that there is one, and then saying, well, if you assume there is, then this argument doesn't work. We have to start by not assuming anything of the sort, and then if the argument has some plausibility, we should realize that Dr. Craig's conclusions accordingly have less plausibility. I move on now to the argument I gave concerning the idea that religious belief would warp our moral values. And here Dr. Craig believes he's caught me in a bind because he says that, well, I said I don't believe in objective moral values, so how can I say, for example, that sending Iranian children across a minefield is objectively wrong? I needn't say anything of the sort. As far as this argument goes, all I need to say is the following. Even if I didn't believe in objective moral values, what I do know is this. If there are objective moral values, they aren't ones that are going to make something like that right. So if God exists, those things are objectively right. Therefore, God doesn't exist. Okay. Now let me turn to the cosmological arguments, as they're called. These are arguments concerning the beginning of the universe. I'll just start by saying again, I asked Dr. Craig, I issued a challenge to him to tell me which of those 5 words, every event followed another one, which of those 5 words he didn't understand. I'm still waiting for an answer because I haven't heard where the contradiction is in that. Indeed, anybody who knows anything about transfinite arithmetic will know that the notion of minus and plus is indeed defined perfectly well and in a natural way for numbers that are called ordinals, even though it's not defined for numbers that are called cardinals. But I can excuse Dr. Craig for not understanding this because his training is not in mathematics. Okay, now, the next argument was that this is concerning my claim that there's no reason to think the creator of the universe was a person. Dr. Craig quotes Popper and Eccles as people who are dualists and says that it's rather slick of me to say that dualism is obviously a naive view. Well, of course, it may be true that Popper and Eccles don't believe in the materialism that I find attractive, for example. Nevertheless, it's also true that Popper and Eccles, being scientifically minded, believe that whatever human minds are, they are dependent upon, even if not identical with, physical matter. That claim is enough, I claim, to say that Dr. Craig still hasn't given us any reason to think that whatever it was that created the universe, this non-physical entity, was anything like a human mind. Okay, we come now to the teleological or fine-tuning argument. This is the argument which, if you recall, is that it's incredibly unlikely that we should be living in a life-permitting universe. And I'd just like to say a little bit about this. Dr. Craig, again, resorted to two tactics. One of them was appeal to authority. The other one was appeal to metaphor. What I would like to know is whether there are any good empirical reasons whatever for assigning one probability rather than another to saying that the so-called fine-tuned constants have the value that they do. What did he say? Again, I wrote it down. He said that we work out the probability by considering the range of possibilities and then finding out the proportion of that range occupied by life-permitting universes. I can do that with a coin. There is a whole range of logical possibilities. It's logically possible that the coin should vanish. It's logically possible that the coin should turn into an elephant. It's logically possible that the coin should land on its side. I can make 10 million logically possible scenarios in which the coin doesn't land heads. So by Dr. Craig's argument, we should be just as amazed that coins land heads as we should be that the universe exists. Okay, I move on now to the issue concerning objective moral values. Really, this is very simple, and I don't see what the dispute is at all. There are 2 points here. The first point is that if there are objective moral values, it would be absurd to think that they're grounded in God. It would be absurd to think, whatever objective moral values are, that they are ones that make a variety of things right. Let's consider what these things are. Destruction of towns, rape, murder, the killing of people for the practice of homosexuality. If there are objective moral values, they aren't things that make those things right. And second, I can perfectly well say that it's as wrong as you like to rape children or whatever other examples Dr. Craig gave without thinking that they are in some sense objective. I can value things as much as I like without thinking that they are in some magical or metaphysical sense objective. Those two claims come quite sharply apart, and Dr. Craig again is merely playing with our emotions by using particularly distasteful examples as he does. Then we come on to the issue concerning the resurrection. One point that I must apologize to Dr. Craig for not bringing up earlier on, simply because I forgot, was simply to dispute his claim that the resurrection is, as he says, unique in Judaic history. The resurrection is no such thing. I'm not a biblical scholar, as is probably evident by now, but I can think off the top of my head of 2 examples of resurrection in the Old Testament. There's one of them, which is in the first book of Kings, chapter 17, when Elijah resurrects a child. And the other one is in the first book of Samuel, as I call it, the first book of Samuel, which is the famous Witch of Endor passage. So it seems to me to be false that resurrection occupies quite the unique place that Dr. Craig says it does. However, he also seemed not quite to grasp what I was saying about reasons for thinking that we should have extraordinary evidence for this. So I'll just try and make it a little bit more graphic. I read a newspaper on Sundays called The News of the World. It's my favourite newspaper. And in it, there's a column called Captain Cash. And what he does is people write into him with various claims. They say, oh, this has happened, can you send me some money, Captain Cash? So somebody might write saying, oh, Captain Cash, my blind, one-legged granny was mugged and they stole her crutches. Can you send me £100 for some more? And he'll write back saying, yes. Usually he makes a pun, so he'll say, I'll stump up the cash or something like that. That's why I like reading it. Well, what sometimes happens is that people send in requests which are absurd. And usually when they send in absurd requests, they end up asking for more money as well. And when that happens, of course, Captain Cash gets a little bit suspicious. Usually you see you have to send in a police report and a photograph and so on. Once somebody sent in a letter saying, "Dear Captain Cash, my neighbour's a witch and she turned my car into a frog. Can you send me £1,000 for a new one?" And now, in a case like that, it's no good just sending a photograph of a frog and an ugly woman with captions saying frog and car and neighbour on it, which is basically what this guy did. Captain Cash was obviously not impressed. He said to hop it or something like that. Now, imagine somebody wrote to Captain Cash and said, "Dear Captain Cash, a man was raised from the dead 2,000 years ago, and I need to tell everybody about it. Give me everything you've got." What do you think Captain Cash would say to that? Go to hell, that's what he'd say. This argument, of course, as we know, is due to Hume, and the argument that I've given is simply a slightly modern updating of Hume's argument. Now, finally, we get to the argument from experience. Dr. Craig actually came out and admitted, so I admire him for his honesty, he came out and admitted that all the religious experiences of the Jews, the Muslims, the Hindus, the Sikhs, the Buddhists, and the atheists, they're all wrong. All these people are wrong. So perhaps Dr. Craig could give us a reason, not something deep down, a reason for thinking that the vast majority of the world's population who have had religious experiences have got it wrong, and he's got it right. It's simply question-begging to say that these other experiences are non-veridical, these other experiences are false, so that doesn't cast any doubt on my experience. Just think of the donkey case. Isn't it sensible to say, in the donkey case, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I should change my mind? And it's not either as if different people have different experiences of the same thing. As I'm sure Dr. Craig would agree, Christians and Jews disagree fundamentally. Christians and Muslims disagree fundamentally. All three of them disagree fundamentally with Buddhists, for example. They have incompatible experiences. Only one of them can be true. And I think I've given you reason for saying that it's mine. Thanks very much.
And authoritarian and ruthless, or something like that, in order to keep this in order, I think. But the rules are that you have 30 seconds to give us your question, and then there will be 2 minutes to the person to whom it's addressed and 1 minute for the other person to respond before we go to another question. The first question will go to Bill, the second question will go to Arif, and we will go to and fro until we run out of time. So I hope that's clear. So if we could have if people who would like to ask a question in 30 seconds, to Bill, putting up their hands first. I will take the first question, which will go to Bill. I think you were over here first.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, Dr. Craig, I'd like to ask, since you think morality is based on some kind of objective yardstick, how do you then explain the many instances of human cultures around the world in the past and today, and in some cases individuals in Western societies as well, with basically Judeo-Christian background, who think, for example, that cannibalism, rape, murder, warfare, torture, genocide, headhunting, you know, if you go on a long, long list,
right.
Why they think that's right, because they don't seem to have any access to this supposedly objective, universal set of moral values that you think.
Yeah.
So isn't it easy to explain by saying it's a combination of genetics and culture and upbringing?
Yes. We mustn't confuse moral epistemology, which is how one comes to know moral values, with moral ontology, which is whether or not these moral values are real and objective. To say that there are objective moral values says nothing about how one might come to know these values, whether they're clear or so forth. Now, I think in many cases they are very clear. And what you'll find is that there really is a kind of moral code that underlies generally most cultures and societies throughout the world. Take even the example of cannibalism, for example. I'm told that by anthropologists